Hello everyone. As we saw in the last episode, the Inquisition was an attempt to root out the still remaining Jewish practitioners in Spain. However, many of the Inquisition's efforts were, at least initially, focused also on the Muslims. In the aftermath of the Reconquista, a large number of Muslims had converted to Christianity. However, many Christian authorities were suspicious over the genuine sincerity of these conversions. Moreover, in some parts of Spain, there were still many individuals practicing the Islamic faith. Now, originally, the Inquisition attempted to enforce Christianity on these peoples. However, they were regularly met with protests, strikes, and rebellions, and feared that if they actually cracked down on the Muslims or suspected Muslims, they would face a full-scale rebellion, if not outright civil war. In the face of a potential upheaval, Spanish authorities decided to target not the recently converted Muslims to Christianity, but their grandchildren. Essentially, they delayed the implementation of enforced Christianity. Spain's attempt to control the non-Christians, Spain's attempt to control the Jews and Muslims happened around the same time they encountered the Mexica people. And the question arose, how should we, the Spanish, treat the Mexica people? Do we treat them like the Jews, or do we treat them like the Muslims? Regardless, Christianity was going to reign supreme. Moreover, as we saw in the last episode, the 14th century was an era in which people believed in supernatural forces and supernatural entities such as necromancers, witches, and demons. We saw in the last episode how the Inquisitor Nicolau Imeric reflected these beliefs, and the same decade of Imeric's birth, you had these religious beliefs affirmed by the then Pope John the 22nd. John the 22nd issued an official Papal Bull, that is an official statement by the Catholic Church. This was called the Super Ilius Specula, and this document affirmed the legitimate existence of these supernatural and malevolent entities. And no one could disagree with the Pope because only heretics would disagree with the Pope, and you weren't a heretic, were you? And at the end of the 15th century, just as the Spanish are encountering the Mexica people and the indigenous Americans, you have another Pope, Pope Innocent VIII, who also publishes a document affirming the legitimate existence of supernatural entities. He affirmed the existence of witches and legitimized the investment of resources to engage in their persecution and suppression. In this atmosphere, Imeric's Directorium Inquisitorium was followed with another book. In 1487, you had the Malleus Maleficarum published, also known as the Hammer of Witches. And this was arguably the most well-known and therefore most popular and widespread treatise against witches and heresy. This work gained widespread popularity just as the Spanish were conquering American peoples. This book also followed the theme that since the popes declared the legitimate existence of witches, demons, necromancers, and other forces, you cannot question their existence, because to do so would question the Pope. And the Pope is the representative of God on earth. Therefore, to question the Pope would be to question God, and once again, only heretics, deviants, and perhaps even witches question God. The Malleus Maleficarum recommended torture as a means to persecute those enemies of the Christian faith. The largest threat, the book argued, was that of idolatry. Now, the word idolatry derives from two Greek words, the first of which being eidolon, meaning image, and the second latria, meaning adoration. So from a purely etymological point of view, idolatry means the adoration of images or the worship of images. However, from a Christian background, it means worshiping a non-Christian God, or at least worshiping images of God instead of God itself. Nonetheless, in the context of Spanish culture, idolatry played a huge role in Spain's imperial expansion. Both in European Spain as well as American Spain, the classification of non-Christian peoples as idolaters allowed Spaniards to create a group of others to be controlled. It essentially allowed the Spanish to craft their own identity as a Christian and pious people in contrast to those people over there who were non-Christians. The others were Jews. The others were Muslims. The others were the Mexica. The creation of an enemy group creates an enemy to attack. It justifies the investment of resources towards these people's persecution and subjugation. The creation of an other, which is non-Christian for Spain, justified the innumerable resources being sent to Spanish America, the friars, the military resources such as the soldiers, the economic investment. Moreover, the idea of fighting idolatry and therefore idolaters essentially creates an invisible enemy. An enemy which cannot be 100% defeated. Idolatry is an idea, and how could you defeat an idea? Waging war against an idea means that you essentially have a blank check to legitimize an endless occupation, or, if you will, an forever war. Moreover, portraying and classifying these non-Christians as enemies of the faith classified them as enemies against the people, the Spanish people, as pious devotees of the Catholic faith. In essence, the creation of this class of people, the Jews, Muslims, and Mexica, who believe in the devil, as claimed, essentially puts a humanitarian spin on military conquest. It legitimizes the violence through the pursuit of the final goal. In essence, the ends justify the means. That is, to create a more godly world, we need to do horrible things to arrive at this more godly world. And it's okay, because the ends justify the means. A godly world is worth fighting for. It is worth the bloodshed. Therefore, the bloodshed is irrelevant. Bringing us back to the American hemisphere. In the wake of the Spanish conquest, the implementation of Christianity was not immediate. In fact, after the conquest, small groups of local communities and peoples continued to practice their religious faith as before the arrival of the Spaniards. For the Spanish authorities who were claiming the successful implementation of a godly order in the American hemisphere, this of course posed a problem. And the Spanish authorities attempted to deal with this problem. A little over 2 decades after the fall of the Aztecs, Fray Juan de Zumárraga, the Bishop of Mexico City, was given authority to establish the Inquisition in Mexico. With the support of the Franciscan community, Spanish authorities in Mexico began trying those accused of committing crimes against the Catholic faith. And this brings us to one particular individual, Martín Ocelotl. Now, we as historians really don't have a clear view of who Martín was. According to him, he claimed to be an Aztec high priest who performed important religious ceremonies before the arrival of the Spaniards. But historians questioned this claim because his age at the time before the Spanish invasion would have been too young to garner the sort of respect that Aztec high priests usually garnered in Mexica society. Later, historians completely disagree, and we have a whole bunch of images and figures of what type of person Martín could have been. Nevertheless, the Spanish were trying to impose a Christian way of life on a previously pagan people. Before the arrival of the Spanish, Aztecs practiced a variety of relationship arrangements, including monogamy, polygamy, and bigamy, which the Catholic Church did not like. In particular, the Catholic Church urged Martín to give up his former ways of living and marry one of his wives. Just one. Yet, this was not the only problem that authorities had with Martín's way of life. Eventually, the scale of Martin's crimes against Christianity became known through his trial. He was accused of a whole range of various offenses. Apparently, Martin was making predictions, something that was a little too close to the heretical practice of divination. Martin was also accused of bewitching people, that is, laying curses on other individuals. There were even rumors swirling that Martin even possessed the power to transform himself into an animal, such as the jaguar. Some even claimed that Martin was immortal. But perhaps Martin's greatest threat was the fact that he was influential. In fact, some historians consider Martin to be a sort of demagogue, or a religious prophet, or the potential leader of a resistance movement. In fact, whenever friars left villages believing that they had successfully spread the word of God, Martin would undo their work. He would explain how the Catholics were wrong, and how their faith was wrong, and how the faith of the Mexica people was correct. One of the people who accused Martin of possessing supernatural powers was the encomendero, or Spanish slave master, from around the area of Lake Texcoco. He accused Martin of conversing with the devil. Apparently, Martin had gone down to the lake to pray to his pagan gods. According to his testimony, Martin went in the middle of the night. He burned incense and said many incantations. Then he floated above the rocks. And according to the encomendero, quote, the devil came and spoke with him for a long time and told him what to do and where to go. Another damning piece of evidence used at the trial was apparently Martin was nicknamed the devil, but subsequent historians realized that the scribes mistranslated the Nahua word for young man as the devil. For all these reasons, the Inquisition saw Martin as too great of a threat to handle. They arrested him. Yet when face to face with the Inquisition, Martin was not scared. He had no fear in the face of the Holy Inquisition. In fact, Martin demonstrated confidence, if not outright arrogance. Apparently, Martin was so emboldened as to proclaim his own prophetic vision. Quote, recently 2 apostles with great fangs and other frightful things were sent by God, and they said that the missionaries would become Tzitzimime, which is a very ugly demon. Now, the Florentine Codex describes the Tzitzimime as, quote, demons of darkness who will come down and eat men. The Tzitzimime in the Aztec religion were stellar demons, that is, star demons. These star demons laid dormant in the vastness of space, hidden amongst the cosmos, sleeping, waiting. They were most dangerous in periods of uncertainty. It was believed that the Tzitzimime would descend upon the earth, eat the humans, and end the world. And thus a new age and a new cycle would be born again. Now, Martin's prophecy subverted Christian authority because, according to Martin, God's apostles, the apostles of Christianity, came to him, not the friars, not the bishop, and not the Inquisition. He was appropriating the missionary work of the friars. Martin was claiming that he spoke for God, not the Catholics. In addition, Martin portrayed the Catholics as the agents of the Tzitzimime, that the Catholic friars were not who they seemed. They were not to be believed, for they were agents of the Tzitzimime. After all, Martin basically said, look around you. Is this something the true God would want? The destruction of our civilization, the murder of our peoples? The God that the Spanish brought was not the God of peace. It was not the God of love thy neighbor. The God of the Spanish was the God of war, death, and destruction. Hearing such blasphemies, the Inquisition had had enough. Martin was ordered to go to Seville, the headquarters of the Spanish Inquisition. Yet Martin's case was amongst many. He was not the only one to feel the wrath of the Inquisition. Other indigenous Americans faced a whole range of punishments, from flogging, imprisonment, banishment, and in one case, One indigenous leader was burned at the stake. What all these cases reveal is that the Spanish authorities took European practices that they used to control the Jews and Muslims, brought them to the American hemisphere, and used these same practices to control the Mexica people. Of course, adapting these practices to the local environment they were operating in. In the 16th century, the Jews, the Muslims, and the Mexica shared a colonial wound given by the Spanish Empire. They shared the experience of being outsiders, of being others in a rising Spanish Empire who saw them as stepping stones to a more godly world order.